Well, the thing we want to look at is Israel is a scattered sheep. Verse 17 of Jeremiah 50, Israel is a scattered sheep. The lions have driven him away. First, the king of Assyria has devoured him, and last, this Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has broken his bones. Now, when God brought judgment on the New Testament churches and congregations, this resulted in a scattering of the people of God. The true believers that were within the churches were driven out throughout the period of the Great Tribulation time, even before God commanded his people to come out of the church. The false doctrine and gospels of the churches were driving the child of God out. Just think when maybe during those years you attended church. I remember this very well, going into a church, and you're sitting there and you're listening carefully, and maybe you speak to the pastor afterwards and you try to get a feel for what they believe, where do they stand on salvation, what is their position on the Bible, and so forth. And without fail, there would be errors in the church, serious errors concerning salvation. They would believe in free will, or they would say it's by the grace of God, but you have to do your part. There would always be an element added, even in the Reformed churches, of free will. Or when you add any kind of element of free will, you're adding a work. So they were adding work to grace, and sometimes they would try to hide it, but they would do so. Or there was something wrong with the baptism, or they had some strange idea about the Lord's table, or we could go on for a long time with the problems that are in the churches. And the child of God was being made sad, was being cast down, and there was no feeding of that sheep. And so we wandered to another church until finally we left the church. We were scattered and driven out of the churches until God finally, for our own good and benefit, commanded his people come out or depart out and flee to the mountains. And then that also was a result of the fact there was no truth in the congregations. Their unfaithfulness and disobedience really led to God commanding his people out. So the scattering of the believers within the churches was a result of God's judgment upon them, but that was due to their unfaithfulness. And also that great multitude outside of the churches and congregations remained scattered. They became saved, but they weren't gathered together during the period of the Great Tribulation. God was dealing with them outside of the churches, yes. But again, it was a failure of the church, a failure to teach and hold to the truths of the Word of God, a failure of being faithful stewards that kept that great multitude out of the church, and therefore they also were scattered as a result of the judgment upon the churches and congregations. Now we read in Joel chapter 3, in the first couple of verses, Joel 3, verse 1, "For behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations, and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people, and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and parted my land." Here God is referring to Judgment Day. Notice he says that he will gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat. A little further on, in Joel 3 and verse 12, it says, "Let the heathen be wakened, and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there will I sit to judge all the heathen." And heathen, by the way, is an English word that is translated as nation or nations. The word goy in the Hebrew can be translated to heathen or nation or Gentile. And here God says, "I sit to judge all the heathen," or all the nations round about. Verse 13, now notice this. "Put ye in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, get you down, for the press is full. The fats overflow, for their wickedness is great." And the fats are the wine presses. And notice how God relates judging the nations in this valley of Jehoshaphat with putting in the sickle and harvest. Again, that relates to Revelation 14, and it is referring to the period immediately after the Great Tribulation when judgment began, which was May 21, 2011. Well, in Joel 3 verse 2, where the Lord gathers the nations and brings them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat and says, and will plead with them there. The word plead can be translated as judgment or execute judgment. The Lord will execute judgment with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel. Now remember, in Jeremiah 50, we had looked at this back in verses 10 and 11 of Jeremiah 50. It says, and Chaldea shall be a spoil, and all that spoil her shall be satisfied, saith Jehovah, because ye were glad, because ye rejoiced, O ye destroyers of mine heritage, because ye are grown fat as the heifer at grass, and bellow as bulls. And Chaldea is another name for Babylon. Babylon will be spoiled because she was glad and rejoiced as she was a destroyer of God's heritage. Now, Babylon is used to represent the nations of the world. Babylon is a picture of the Gentiles. Remember how God said in Revelation 11 that the holy city was given unto the Gentiles. Well, the Gentiles are the nations. Babylon represents the nations. And here in Joel 3 verse 2, God is executing judgment with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel. Now here, he's executing judgment upon the nations. In Jeremiah 50, he's executing judgment upon Babylon because spiritually they are one and the same. And then it goes on to say at the end of verse 2 of Joel 3, whom, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. See, the Gentiles are to blame. The nations are to blame for scattering Israel because it was Satan and his forces, the Gentiles, the unsaved who entered into the congregations that tread underfoot the holy city. And because of that, the people of God were scattered. And because of that, those saved during the latter rain were not gathered into the church. And therefore, it was as if they were scattered also. And God now is judging the Babylonians. He's judging the nations because they did this. Notice how God relates judging the nations in this valley of Jehoshaphat with putting in the sickle and harvest. Again, that relates to Revelation 14, and it is referring to the period immediately after the Great Tribulation when judgment began, which was May 21, 2011.